So this is kind of nice being here in the Carpenter Center with our exhibit, Measure for Measure. This is something that I put together with an artist, Leah Halloran. Peter Mays at the Los Angeles Art Association asked if I was interested in curating an exhibit, and it seemed like a really interesting opportunity. At the time, I was writing my book, Knocking on Heaven's Door, and one of the very important themes in it is scale, and how scale helps us understand the universe in science, and of course otherwise as well, how we focus on things, what scale we look at it. It gives us a lot of insight into why we have the intuitions that we do, and why it's challenging to do science, but also how one idea at one scale feeds into another. So the idea that we had was to sort of combine together what a scientist thinks, how scientists apply the notion of scale, with how an artist might. Of course, artists are always thinking about scale. How do you portray things and try to convey either something very big or very small? But in the universe, we're talking about much larger scales, ranging from 10 to the 27 meters, 27 orders of magnitude bigger than the size of a person, to something like 35 orders of magnitude smaller. So there's this enormous range of scales. On top of that, one of the really interesting things is that the physical laws, the intuition, the ingredients that you use at any given scale can be different than at another. You know, in thinking about how to curate an art science exhibition, there's a lot of different directions you can go in. Are you trying to make it about science? Or are you trying to make it about art, or are you just saying something in science is pretty? But what I wanted to do was convey a theme, an idea that matters both for scientists and artists, and just see what they would do with that. And one of the really rewarding aspects of it was that these artists actually got really interested in science. Their pieces aren't necessarily scientific, but they definitely had scientific ideas in mind. Misan has these diatoms, so these are biologically inspired objects. But then what she's done with it is play with it in an artistic sense by etching it, having these mirrored surfaces. Katrina's piece over here, I think, is one of the sort of more intriguing ideas that's sort of trying to encompass this kind of notion. It's something that if you view it from far away, it just looks like a pop art piece. But then you would go up close and you would see that it's a face, it's someone staring at you. And it's more than just a face. What she tried to capture was moments of emotion. And one of the fun things that got discussed at the panel discussion we had on this was how she thought this idea related to the theme of scale. And in fact, there was a psychologist there who recognized very much what she was trying to do, how these emotions were sort of summarizing a whole bunch of feelings and ideas. And it really does kind of wrap up that notion. So the idea is that on a very small scale, you're seeing one thing, you're seeing an eye, you're seeing a face. On a large scale, you're seeing this pop art piece. And of course, this is a very familiar notion, but in physics, we're using this all the time. Felicity just had a lot of fun with her piece. She actually was inspired by notions of physics. I mean, they're very, very loosely applied, but the mirror idea was supposed to inspire ideas about curvature of space. And she also, of course, had very different scales that appear within her piece. She really took advantage of all the opportunities we had in terms of using all the walls, the ceiling, the floor. I really enjoyed what she did. When Lee and I were choosing who would be part of the exhibit, we knew that Susan would definitely be part of it. And what she does is she takes books and carves the books. And honestly, it wasn't so much the theme of scale at the time. It was just that I really loved her carved books. It was just fun the way she could make almost a sculpture out of the individual pictures that are in some of these old books that are beautifully illustrated. And you know, we tried to think creatively about what she could do with the idea of scale. And she chose books very much related to the theme, such as Gulliver's Travels or Alice in Wonderland. But then it turned into something bigger than that. She made this sort of reading room, and all the books that she chose are related to scale in different ways. And it's fun because it really makes you think about how omnipresent scale is in the way we view the world. And here is very much fun because she has salt shakers. And what she did is actually take the ingredients out of recipe books and cut them out and put them into salt shakers. So here we have artichoke tuna casserole, etc. And although it sounds, again, sort of simple, in a way, that's what the universe does. I mean, we have these very simple ingredients, and they get put together in these amazingly complicated ways. So this is another piece that sort of very literally illustrates how things are very different in small scales from large scales. Here we have a giant redwood tree, a giant sequoia that Barb photographed, but she didn't photograph it all at once. It's all these little pieces. And these little pieces, you see the structure of the bark, you see the internal elements. Of course, as a scientist, you could go even further. But when you look at this little picture, you're not seeing anything that looks like this giant tree. But then looked at from far away, with different types of resolution, you see a different object. So again, the idea is that if you want to see these fundamental elements, you have to have more resolution. You have to look at smaller scales. And it's interesting to see what you can get when you can put together these smaller elements. We had a couple of other things too that were sort of a little further afield. Elizabeth had this idea that she would apply scale to sort of more social scales and economic scales. It was a very different notion. It certainly wasn't what I had in mind when I started with the scientific idea. But here, in the original implementation, she didn't do that, but here she's sort of playing with the Occupy Wall Street movement by having this tent to sort of show again, I mean, in fact, the fact that they talk about the 1%, in some sense they are talking about economic scales there. And another thing that was really interesting was, so what she did is she went around and gave cupcakes to people in different communities in Los Angeles, from Beverly Hills to the homeless shelter. And in exchange for the cupcake, asked them to write something about how they felt about it. And what was interesting about it was, again, this idea that when you think of this mass of people, you can think of it as a mass, but then having them write this individual card, you focused on them as an individual. So again, the notion of scale got made, and just artistically, she had her sprinkles blown up. In the original exhibit, there were sort of mirrors with sort of an infinite wall of sprinkles. It was a lot of fun. And the final one is Zig, who did these videos, really mesmerizing images that sort of go back and forth along them. Again, making up a bigger image from a smaller one. And people told me they could sit here for a long time just watching this evolve. Again, I think one of the big ideas in science is that what you see isn't all there is. You have to go look inside, and you need tools to do that. You need to be able to have the resolution to see different scales, and that's part of what we were trying to show in this exhibit, and it's certainly part of what I was trying to talk about at greater length and more scientifically when I wrote my book, because I think to understand the kind of physics that I do, this particle physics, it's such extremely small scales, or cosmology, which applies to such large scales, you need some sort of context, and you need to understand this fact that the laws can look different. It's not necessarily going to be guided by your intuition of human scales, what we see in our daily life, that you need to incorporate both measurements from the very small and very large scale, and really absorb that into your way of thinking and acknowledge that the rules and ingredients can be really different.